You're listening to Bold Hearts, Big Moves, the show for female entrepreneurs who want it all: a thriving business, deep self love, and fulfilling relationships. I'm Erin Anderson, and each week we will dive into how to set stronger boundaries, make empowered choices, and show up in life and business with boldness, authenticity, and heart. Because let's be real, the money you make is directly related to the love that you have for yourself and the strength of your relationships. So if you're ready to lead with love and make those big moves with those bold hearts, let's dive in.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bold Hearts, Big Moves. Guys, I'm really excited today because I have with us author Vicki Paris Goodman. And Vicki is an amazing author. I've had the privilege of sitting down and chatting with her about her book, To Sound with Love, The Surviving Spouse's Story of Inspired Grief. Or inspired story. I kept getting that wrong as we were chatting too. But as I've sat down and chatted with her, it was really clear that one of the things that we wanted to talk about was this idea that trauma and tragedy don't have to change trajectory. And that is a big deal for, I think, the female entrepreneur, because trajectory is something that's always on our mind. But it's so easy to let trauma and the tragedy of things really stop us in our wake, like stop us straight from filling our mission and purpose, from telling our stories, and from showing up on the planet in a big way. And so I invited Vicki to come and talk with us today about this idea because she has some beautiful insights about what trauma and tragedy actually can do. And so thank you, Vicki, for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Erin.
You are so welcome. So welcome. I'm very excited. I really am.
Me too.
And so I want you to kind of introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners. Tell your story a little bit so that way they can understand like why you're so passionate about helping people understand why tragedy doesn't have to be so tragic.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm not one of those really helpful types, that's kind of selfless. I've always been kind of the opposite. So the fact that I'm on this mission to help people with this, what it really means is that I've made a big transformation and that I've finally found a niche that feels right to me for helping others, which I wasn't sure would ever happen. So I am a supposedly retired mechanical engineer, and I was a real property appraiser for part of my career too. And I'm a violinist and a singer. And I reviewed theater for over 20 years in Long Beach, California. So I've done, a few things. And soon after moving to a retirement home in the mountains of central Arizona from Southern California, we got a terminal diagnosis for my husband, Sam. We'd been
Oh,
married almost 22 years. Yeah, he passed away from cancer in 2019. So he lived for 2 additional years after the diagnosis. And what happened starting on the day he passed was really unexpected and extraordinary. It was as if a helping hand was coming from somewhere outside myself to lead me forward in a more positive way, a more intentional way than I believe I would have on my own. And what's extraordinary about that is I was raised very secular. And even though I had begun to believe in a higher power some years before, I hadn't taken that belief very far. It remained a very rudimentary belief. It was basically just that, well, all this around us couldn't have happened on its own. So there must be a higher power, end of story at that
right.
point. But when Sam passed, not only was I flooded with optimism, which was almost unseemly because it began on the day he passed, and he was the love of my
Wow.
life.
Right.
Yeah, so not only did that happen, but I was offered monthly meetings for a full year after he passed with the chaplain from the hospice we had used for him. And I said yes to that. And the first thing I wanted to know from her was, tell me about the afterlife. I want to know if Sam's soul is still around, and if so, where it is. And she recommended I read the story of a secular neurosurgeon who had had a near-death experience of his own. And his whole story is really divinely inspired. He had no way of getting this brain infection. He was being taken care of in the hospital by his colleagues. And, they couldn't get the infection under control. So he was going to die. And if he didn't, he was going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life. So his family should hope that he dies. Well, obviously, he survives to tell the story, resume his career, go on speaking tours, no brain damage whatsoever. So
This
his
is
story is
insane.
incredible.
Oh my gosh,
And
yes.
but for me, his story brought me the rest of the way to fully believing in God and an afterlife. I found his story so persuasive, so convincing. And so that's that's kind of the start. That really was the beginning of not the optimism that had already happened, but reading his story was the beginning of many of the insights that came to me later that
Mm,
became the material for this movement to to help people see death and loss and really any adversity at all in a completely different way, and know that they don't have to spend a certain portion of their life after this trauma of losing
yeah,
someone they loved so much, that they don't have to really spend any time sort of in frozen mode,
yeah,
that they can move on immediately. And
yeah.
I have a yeah, so that's kind of the gist that we should maybe start from.
No, I love that. I truly love that. And it's amazing how powerful other people's stories are. I mean, you're talking here about like somebody else's story starting your, well, not really starting, but like really amplifying your story. You know what I mean? Do you have the name, by the way, of the man that, do you remember?
Yeah, the neurosurgeon.
Yeah,
Yeah, his name is Eben, Eben, unusual first name, Alexander.
Eben Alexander. Okay, so
Eben Alexander. Yeah.
yeah, that's another good book because like I kind of want to go read that now because that's such a fantastic story. And then like how it created a different like an almost more passionate trajectory for you, because I
Yes.
mean a lot of people would say like I've lost the love of my life. I just don't know how to keep going. And then watching you, it's almost like fueled your going. You know what I mean? And it's like one of the things I tell people all the time is that I'm actually grateful for like the things that I went through, like all the traumas, and I've gone through some serious stuff, like some really, really serious stuff. And I'm so grateful for it because, it unlocked different parts of my brain. It unlocked my like it heightened my senses. It's done amazing, amazing work for me that has turned around and created business sense for me and helping me, like you said, like you're doing with your book, it's helped me change people's stories on a very personal level, right? And so like why do you think that trauma and tragedy seem to cause people to stop or slow down in their goals?
I think there are a number of reasons, and one of them is guilt. I
Mm,
it, if it well, it depends on what the trauma or tragedy is, but if it's the loss of a loved one, our culture has conditioned us to believe, number one, that death is tragic. I say it's not, based on the fact that there is, well, let's not call it fact, but most people believe in a loving God and a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful beyond words afterlife. And if you have that belief system, as I've found most people do, then why is death tragic? It only means that God's plan was for my loved one to pass into this beautiful place ahead of me. It means that God's plan for me is that I will join Sam, my husband Sam, there eventually. And in the meantime, I have important things to do, things to learn, maybe things to teach others. Okay, so that's one thing. But that the rest of that cultural conditioning includes a lot of guilt around how we should grieve and how long we should grieve and how we shouldn't have too much fun or do anything too interesting or enjoyable for a period of time. You know, people believe
The morning
this.
time. Yes, yes, the morning.
Yeah, yes. And I don't believe that's true. I may have at one time, but given my experience with losing Sam, and I don't really believe I've lost him, as we now know,
Right.
he's around in a different way. Um, I believe that when you go to a place like the afterlife, a place of such love, there are no negative emotions there. So there's no such thing as anger or jealousy and other negative emotions. Only your loved one only wants what's best for you and what will make you the happiest and most fulfilled and will be and and they want to see you utilizing the life you have left without them to the best of your ability.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Mm-hmm.
have, from that perspective, you have no time to waste.
Yeah.
Given that there's no jealousy or anger, in the afterlife, there can't possibly be when you're surrounded by that much love. That's one of the insights that I was blessed with. So, it's not as though you'll be dishonoring this person who wants you to get going,
Right.
even if it means you're going to be sad while you get going. I'm not saying that there should be no such thing as grief. There have been big changes to your life.
Mm.
And whenever we face that radical a change, even if we expected it because a diagnosis happened 2 years before the death, we might need to move forward and it might not be great for a while. I think
Yeah.
that's the best way I can put it. See, what happened with me is I started doing all these things. And I was having the time of my life almost from the beginning. Yet I would come home and feel empty inside.
Mm.
And I knew that was because Sam wasn't here to do the thing with me that I was having so much fun doing. Or if he wasn't going to do it with me, when I got home, I couldn't share it with him. This is what I was used to doing from having been married to Sam for all those years. And I would feel empty inside, but I realized there was nothing I could do about that. It
Yeah.
was just the way it was going to be for a while. So even though I knew things weren't going to be great, I was on the right path. Do these things, have these new experiences. Okay, so it's not going to feel, fabulously wonderful. It's okay because this is about the best way things can be for now. And
Yeah.
I accepted it. And, eventually I found someone else to be with, in a relationship. And I was having new experiences and traveling to new places, some of which I might not have been able to do if Sam had lived. So that's another thing. And I don't feel guilty thinking that way.
Right.
It's a legitimate thought. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it because it's okay to grieve. Like absolutely, because you like you said, you've had a major change in your life. Uh and I'm actually just thinking about a friend of mine, her grandbaby, her great grandbaby actually just passed away 2 days ago from SIDS. And this little guy was like maybe 4 or 5 months old, bringing tons of joy to the whole family, and then all of a sudden just gone like that, right? And my mama heart, like I'm sitting there like, oh, ow, right? Because I've got 6 kids, right? And like the idea of losing one of them is so sad. So sad. And it would be in a sense, quite tragic, but at the same time, it really does come down to the beliefs, and this is kind of what you're saying, like it comes down to your belief system in that moment. Like for me, I would really, really struggle, I think, for a few days just because I would miss them so much if one of my babies was taken from me, right?
Hmm.
But I know a few things, like one of my beliefs is because we have a loving God, what is taken from us in this time will be restored to us then, so like I'll have the opportunity. So say like my little 3-year-old girl, like worst case, the worst thing I can think of is her being taken away from me. um I would have the opportunity to raise her in a world with no hate, no sin, no adversary. You know what I mean? And like
Yep.
it's that type of belief that I'd be clinging to. The other thing too is I know like we have such a deep connection, me and my all of my kids, like all of my kids, that if I lost one, I would know for a fact that they would want me to keep going. And I also know that, like you were saying, like they're just it's not ever like they're completely gone. They're just it's just a different form, right?
Hmm.
And
That's right. Yeah, they're here in a different way so that you never really lose them. They're
mhm.
just, you might see, if you're observant, you might see things in life and you have this strong feeling, oh, that's a message or a manifestation of my child uh, in the afterlife saying hello or saying, "I'm Mom, I'm here."
Yeah.
They're still here. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and they
And you have to
absolutely
be
are.
observant, which I'm not particularly. I have to force myself to be to see little things that Sam sends my way. And I don't get as many as some people have, but there have been a few.
Yeah, I get that. I totally get that. And what else is really amazing about this? Like of course we're talking about like the loss of a loved one, but sometimes like tragedy and trauma come from the loss of, say, like a goal or the realization that maybe you'll never reach that, or like loss comes to us in more than just one way. And I know like in my own personal journey, like with my business and things like that, that there have been times where I've realized that everything I've tried to do wasn't going to work, right? And so like it was like a loss for me. Like we've had loss of loved ones, loss of money, loss of relationships, loss of marriages, loss. Like it happens to us in more than one way. And you can almost kind of it's obviously not as severe, I don't think, as like a death of a loved one. But whatever we lose, it doesn't necessarily mean that, well, then there's no point, right? Sometimes it gives us inspired action in our trajectory. I know like for me, like a lot of the losses that I've received, if I would sit back for just a minute and think about or just even feel into what I was experiencing and accepting it, there's always a message, so just very, very powerful message in that. You know what I mean?
Yes, you said sometimes first, and then you went to always. And I was going to say you should have said always, which you did eventually, because there's always a lesson in any adversity that we
Mm-hmm.
face if you just open yourself to what it could be. In my case, I can almost always figure out what God is trying to teach me with these things that happen. And the sooner you get God's takeaway, maybe he'll stop trying to teach you that lesson, and he'll move on to something else, which could be scary, but
Right.
yeah, we need to pick up on these lessons, because that's one of the main ways I believe we grow. And so there's always a lesson, whether it's in business or just something to learn to get through life. There's
Mm-hmm.
always a lesson. In my case, most of the lessons God has tried to teach me were about patience, because I am a type A, impatient. And, it took me decades to get the message.
Right.
And I
Mm-hmm.
won't say I'm never impatient anymore, but at least I've moved to a place and have a lifestyle now that's far where the frustrations are fewer and farther between. And I think that's what type A's need, so that they have time to regroup before the next frustration occurs, so that it
Yeah, it
doesn't
makes
keep
sense.
building until the volcano erupts, if that's
Yeah.
an apt metaphor.
Yeah.
So.
And, I love what you were saying there too. Like you say you struggle with patience, and like that's not something that I personally struggle with myself, but for me, it's like organization, right? Like, so I get this idea in my head and I just want to run with it, and I get another one and I want to run with it, and all of a sudden I'm feeling overwhelmed because I have too many projects and I'm not tracking the way I should be, and like it gets like my problem is I get so overwhelmed with all the things I could do, right? And I have to bring it down, do one project, get it organized, finish it, do another project, organize it, get it finished, right? Like I have to work that way so I don't overwhelm myself. And that's one of the things I personally am trying to learn and continue learning, right? And that's what's amazing about this, like what you're saying is that because of that lesson, and we were kind of talk about this, like because of these lessons, trauma and tragedy can actually further our goals.
Absolutely, they can. If you let them, how you hear stories of a parent who lost a child and started, an organization like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example,
Mm-hmm.
that happened many, many years ago. And so many people start foundations, or they go on some sort of a mission to accomplish something important that will help others after they lose a loved one, for example, and maybe after some other type of adversity or trauma has occurred. So I think some people can be very motivated by the trauma in their lives. They
Yeah.
somehow, and I feel this too, let's make some sense of this. Let's have some good come out of it. And what better way can you honor, if it's in the case of a loss of a loved one, what better way can you honor that person than to do something to help others? But I also think that even apart from that motivation, it's really helpful to just move on. And if you feel like you simply can't, pick one small thing, because once you take one step forward, it shows you that you can. And it doesn't feel as awful as you think it will. In fact, it may feel great. And that will prompt you to move on in bigger ways very quickly. So when I
Yeah.
hear about someone getting stuck from adversity or grief, those are the people I most want to help,
Yeah.
because it's not as tough to move on as I believe they think it's going to be.
Yeah. Well, and and again, like I also believe so I currently have a client right now who's suffering a loss. She just left her marriage of 16 years, right? Because her husband was narcissistic and like he didn't physically abuse her, but he was abusive in other ways. And she finally had had enough. And so she's feeling this loss of these 16 years of her life, and she wants to create this amazing thing. But my advice to her is just kind of similar to what you were saying is slow down, right? It's okay if we take like one step today, another step tomorrow, and another step. Like it's okay for those rest periods too, right? because rest we can find some beautiful, like we were talking about, we can find the lessons, we can find the trajectory, we can remind ourselves again, like of the things that we loved to do, and sometimes even get a more direct line to the things that we're meant to do in this life. You know, as she's been resting and as she's kind of been like, I want to get going, but I really feel like I just need to pause for a minute, right? She's realizing like what kind of relationships she wants in her life. What does what are the things that she values? She's coming back into herself, right? And this is the thing, like, I think that when we get into grief and we get into trauma and tragedy and loss, it's okay to give yourself some time. You know, it is. It's totally okay to give yourself some time and uh really feel what you're feeling and experience what you're experiencing. Um and rest, right? Like this is something I've been talking a lot about lately. It's just this rest period. But we don't want to stay there. That is the biggest picture. That is the biggest thing. And so, what are some of your most powerful mindset shifts that you have had around trauma and tragedy? And how have they helped you shift maybe out of that rest period and out of that need to grieve for a little bit and into reaching your goals?
Right. I'm glad you brought this up because I may have given the impression that people should just go full steam ahead, if they suffer an important loss. And one of the things that a couple of people told me after Sam passed was keep yourself as busy as possible so you don't have time to think or feel. And I instinctively knew that was bad advice
Yeah.
because you have to process what's happened to your life. So one of the tips I give to others who have lost someone important to them is create a balance between, I'll call it activity and quiet time, meaning, yes, do those fun things, but not at the expense of a little quiet time each day, whether it be just sitting and thinking or reading a book or writing in a journal or hiking, taking a walk. You
Praying.
have to
I'm,
be able to process what's happened
yeah.
to your life. So that's really important. So yes, move on, but not at the expense of the processing of the changes to your life. And the other, one of the most important insights I received that really is it caused such a shift in my thinking. That happened actually over 2 years after Sam passed. I had already published my book, and so I put some of these really important insights that came afterwards into 3 audio episodes that are free and online, and we can talk about that later, maybe. But the biggest one was that death isn't really tragic,
Hmm.
even though our culture has conditioned us all to think it is. And we already talked about why that isn't so. If you have that belief system where there's this loving God and a beautiful beyond words afterlife, then death should be a cause for celebration, not a tragedy to be um, that is meant to stop us cold.
Hmm.
So, this is a belief shift, a perspective shift that I would really like to get more people with this belief system, with this spiritual belief system or religious belief system to embrace, because right now people aren't connecting the dots. The cultural conditioning is too powerful. But if they realize this is what I believe, yet the culture is telling me to see death and death as tragic, they don't match. The belief system doesn't match that conditioning. Trying to get people to connect the dots and see that God has a plan for each of us, and that if someone we love passes away ahead of us, it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad for us at all. They went to a beautiful place and they got to go there earlier, maybe than expected. And oh my gosh, lucky them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that is a very key thing because I do feel like there are a mixture of both uh celebrations and maybe even a little bit of sadness, when somebody passes into the next life. Because I think about this baby, right? I'm pretty sure Heavenly Father's up there happy to have that little baby back in his arms. He's got grandparents, he's got I think an aunt and uncle. He's got family, like generations of family up there that's welcoming him back. So he's not alone. But I think that, they do miss us too. Like it is different for them. Like even though they can see us, they're with us, they're around us. They can't just put their hand on our shoulder, right, all the time and let us know that they're there and or sit down and have hours long conversations, right? But one of the things that I realized, in my own loss and in my own trauma, right? I was feeling the loss of certain relationships, not in the sense that they personally had died, but the relationship and the way it was did, right? Absolutely did. And I wanted, and I had this thought that if Christ was just before me, then he could heal me. He could take all this pain away. And I didn't realize until later that, oh my gosh, I'm actually putting a major limit on what Christ can do. Just because he's not in front of me doesn't mean he can't influence me. It doesn't mean he can't help me. It doesn't mean that he can't still reach me. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I think this is kind of what you're saying. Like, even though, like, it's okay for us to still grieve. Like, I get that mama grieving her baby. Like, I would be grieving, not having that baby in my arms. I would be sad, very sad. But at the same time, I know for a fact, like, I know that the people that pass on that we love are there still. I felt them. We've had chats. One of my favorite things to tell people to do is to play with God. Like, if you want to get to know him, pull out a board game and you'll move both pieces. He probably will win every time. I mean, he did for me, but I would sit down and I would play these board games with the idea that God was right in front of me and playing with me. And that was some of the times that I learned some of the greatest wisdom and how to heal my broken heart. You know what I
Well, I'll
mean?
have to try that.
It was so fun. It was so fun. And I still do this to this day. Or I love also writing letters back and forth between God. Like I write a letter to him and then I get a little quiet and I write his response back, like whatever I hear. Right? There's still ways, like the ways that we connect with people and the way that we connect in our relationships are still there. We don't have to change the way we connect with people. It might be just a little different how we hear them, but they're still there. And the same thing happens with any type of loss. My relationships, when I let them go the way that they were, even though that was a deep tragedy for me, when I let that go and I allowed God, in a sense, right? My relationships now are fabulous. There's still things that we need to do together to grow. There's still things that we need to do to change. But what else is amazing is the more that I get clear on the things that I need to let go of in relationships. And I set these boundaries and I grow as a person. My money story changes. I just hit six figures this last year because of really honestly what we're talking about is that this idea that trauma and tragedy don't have to change your trajectory. If anything, they can clarify it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just like
Mm-hmm.
it did with you. It's clarified your trajectory. It's clarified my trajectory. And it can clarify our trajectory to the point of creating amazing benefits coming back at us, right?
Absolutely. I can take a step away from the happiness I had with Sam. And at this point, 5.5 years after his passing, it still feels a little weird to say this, but I can still say it. And that is maybe the reason my that I am faced with this next chapter of life is because maybe I was stagnating a little toward the end of my marriage with Sam. Maybe there was so much more for me to do, and God solved that problem. I know that sounds maybe a little
Harsh.
harsh. Yeah, harsh. Thank you. But it has crossed my mind because I can remember some frustrations I was feeling. Not that there might not have been another way for me to deal with that. If Sam had lived, I'm sure something else would have happened that would have eventually alleviated that frustration and allowed me to move forward while we were still married. But I do remember feeling a little bit stuck at that time, that we got the diagnosis. And, it's crossed my mind that maybe this had to happen for both of us for different reasons,
Hmm.
me and Sam, that I needed to be faced with another chapter so that I could do things that I hadn't been able to do before.
I actually do completely understand that. And like, I know it's like if somebody that's hurting, that was going to sound harsh, but to me, somebody who's gone through the healing process, like I actually totally get that. Like I totally get what you're saying because for me, like I've realized that had I not gone through the hard, like absolutely heart-wrenching things that I've gone through, I would not be sitting here doing a podcast. I would not be coaching. I would not be like helping my kids with their mental health and all their emotional struggles and helping them become like better humans. Like I wouldn't get it. I just wouldn't get it. And I've said this so many times that our missions and our purposes are made up of, yes, our passions, our gifts and our talents, because they're both different, actually. Our gifts and our talents are both different. And then our traumas and tragedies.
Yeah,
Because God has said in the scriptures, succor like feed my sheep, succor my people. How do we do that if we don't understand what they're going through?
right. Yeah, I know that some things that happened in my childhood very probably formed the personality that I wound up with, meaning I'm not so sure I would have been the control freak and the perfectionist and the extreme type A I wound up being without these things having happened to
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was a fork in the road. Vicki could have turned out this way or this way. And because of these things that made me, grasp for some control over my life, I wound up, the extreme type A that is now kind of fighting some of those tendencies finally, later in life. So I think these things that happen to us happen probably for a reason.
Yeah.
And I don't have any regrets. I mean, there was so much pain, but I have no regrets because it led me to the things that I'm doing now, which seems so worthwhile. The singing, the violin playing, in an orchestra here, the podcast interviews, the movement to change the way people, think of death and loss and adversity of all kinds. So there's no point regretting these things,
No.
because they made us who we are, and who we are has so much good and so much growth that we have undergone, and it's all good.
Yeah, it is. It is. It really is. And it is all beautiful, but it's also okay to feel what you feel. And I love that message. So quickly, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your book and how can people find it? Where can they find you?
Yes. Okay. Well, my book is To Sam with Love, a surviving spouse's story of inspired grief. Inspired grief is a little bit maybe of an oxymoron, but you can probably understand why I used it now
Yeah.
that you know some of my story. What happened after Sam passed just felt inspired.
Yeah, it does.
So the book is kind of in three parts. I go through some of Sam's life story and a little of my own. In the first portion, the middle portion is from diagnosis to Sam's passing. A lot happened in that time, and I think it's all worth seeing in
Mm.
order to understand the final third of the book, the extraordinary things that happened for me after Sam's passing. So it's a really great sort of a roadmap to how one person, me, uh, ventured so productively and for the most part happily into that next chapter of life and quickly. The other thing is my 3 audio episodes, which are free online. So the audio episodes have all of those insights that came to me after I published the book. And I would encourage everyone to go to inspiredgrief.com, subscribe to the audio episodes, buy the book, get it all. The audio episodes are only about 12 to 15 minutes each. So this is well under an hour to listen to all three. And the book is such a good example of how to move forward and why.
I love that. I love that. Vicki, thank you so much for being here, for chatting with us and helping us, understand and really sit in with this that we don't have to be stopped by loss. It's okay to give yourself time. It's okay to give yourself perspective, like, oh, yes, please do, right? But it's also
Yes.
okay to keep that trajectory going and realizing that whatever it is that you do as an entrepreneur, that it's important. So thank you so much, Vicki, for being here. You've been a fabulous guest. And until next time, guys, we will see you next week. Bye.
All right, Boundary Boss Babes. I'm super excited that you tuned in with me today. Make sure you tune in again next week as we chat about more Boundary Boss Babe topics. We're going to get into so many other things about how to set boundaries with your business, how to set boundaries with your relationships, so you can truly have the time, the money, and the flexibility that you are seeking. So tune in next week. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast. Let your other Boss Babe friends know about it. And also, if you've got any questions, make sure you submit them into the podcast by clicking on the Send Us a Text message at the bottom of the podcast description. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. See you later, Boss Babes.